A 29-year-old woman sits on a pile of rubble near the corner of a destroyed house. There's a little bit of a corner left with some roof attached, but that's all that's left of the structural house. The tornado has done its dirtiest. This is not Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or Joplin, Missouri. It's Conecuh County, Alabama, which is about 150 miles south as the storm flies from Tuscaloosa. The year is 1940. That's the year that the tornado chose to make kindling out of my grandfather's house. It was also home to my mother and me for the time being. My grandmother had died a couple of years before, and my mother and I had moved to live with my grandfather for a while my dad was completing his education at Auburn University. There are pictures. The 29-year-old woman who's sitting on the pile of rubble is my mother. She's quiet. There's a look of sadness in her face, or resignation. But her back is straight, her head is up, her hands are folded. 10, 15 feet away, there's another picture. Another young woman is sitting on a fallen pecan tree. This is a tree that was in the front yard of the old house. It's the tree that my mother and her sisters and her brother had swung on for many, many years. Now it was prone to the ground with the roots sticking up. The young woman is Myrtle, one of Mother's sisters. And she was then living in Evergreen, Alabama, about 18 miles away, and had come up to be of comfort and to survey the damage. And she's sitting there quiet with very little emotion. I have no idea exactly what was going on in her mind, but I'm sure she was collecting a house full of memories. The house was gone. The memories she would keep. And next to her is a little 8-year-old boy. Arms folded, head down. From the look on his face, you would think that the storm that now has gone, left to claim other victims, had moved into his face. I'm that little boy. And I really don't know what I was thinking or feeling. I'm sure it was a mixture of confusion and anger and sadness. I'm sure didn't understand the full implications of what had just happened. But I knew my world had been turned upside down. I don't remember exactly what I was thinking, but I do remember the storm. I was sitting in the living room near the fireplace, reading a Plastic Man comic book. My grandfather had been out in the pasture, and he had seen the tornado as it hit the ridge beyond our house and took out a row of trees. And he ran as fast as he could to get to the house. And he came in to the room that Mother and I were in and called for Mother and I to come help him shut the door. I remember that distinctly because it was so, I didn't know then, but it was so odd. The wind had gotten so strong as the storm was approaching that he could not push the door to by himself. Now, I didn't think about it at the time, of course, but as I revisit that scene today, what occurs to me is how utterly ridiculous it is to shut a door in the face of a storm. But I've heard stories from other people in other similar circumstances as they've done things like that to believe that that must be an instinctive response to a storm. When the storm was over, we had very little left. The chair that I was sitting in, reading the Plastic Man comic book, it survived. And in fact, I'm sitting in that chair as I'm telling you the story. I do remember also looking up, because the storm hit in the front yard, and as it lifted up, it picked up it lifted up the roof and the walls of the house and took them with him. And I can remember looking up and seeing limbs and trees and debris flying overhead. And then it was over. It was a short time. The storm was on its way to claim other victims, and we were left homeless. About dark, Uncle Sammy showed up. He lived a few miles north, and he took us all home with him for the night. I don't remember anything else about that night except one thing. I remember the comfort of sinking into Aunt Martha's feather bed. And I remember how warm and comfortable it felt. And I don't need a psychiatrist to tell me why I remember that. I had survived, I was alive, I was loved, and I knew everything was going to be okay. The tornado had hit our lives so suddenly that we hardly had time to be afraid. But my mother used to talk about her feelings of despair and of not knowing how she was going to put her life and our life back together again. But day by day, the despair wore off and gave way to hope, and life went on. In the last several weeks, tornadoes have taken their toll and unleashed their destructive power on Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Joplin, Missouri, Oklahoma, and places all over the country. Our family survived 1940. My grandfather built a house on the site of the old one and lived in it for several years until he died. Dad graduated from Auburn. Mother and I moved with him to Tallahassee, a little cotton mill town on the banks of the Tallapoosa River, where he taught and I went to high school. For the life of me, I can find no benign or creative purpose in tornadoes. They just happen. But my story, this story, is one of unexplained and uncontrollable chaos, certainly at one level, and of loss. At another, it's the story of holding on and letting go. But I think more important than anything else is a story of recovery and hope. At any rate, that's my story. What's yours?